So as you watch the trends throughout the years, you start to wonder, is there any real basis? Is there anything that I can really know about food and what I should be eating so that I don't go on this pendulum fed by whatever the current fad is? This is part one of a two-part series on teens losing weight. And the next video will be on how to lose weight in a healthy way. But this week I want to cover what you don't need to do to lose weight, and that is eliminating food groups from your diet. Thank you for joining me on Amazingly Deep Thoughts, where I can help you, teens and young women, change your own life and find peace through biblical living. I remember my first diet. I was probably 13 and I really was not heavy at all, but I wanted to be skinny, I wanted to be fit, I wanted a six-pack. And what was the big diet when I was a kid was low fat, low calorie. And we lived in a household where we had margarine and not butter, and we had skim milk and 1% milk and not whole milk, and really everything was focused around that low-fat diet. And then you go forward about 20-30 years and we see that all of that science was debunked, and we have keto, which is an emphasis on high fat, high protein, and low carbs. So as you watch the trends throughout the years, you start to wonder, is there any real basis? Is there anything that I can really know about food and what I should be eating so that I don't go on this pendulum fed by whatever the current fad is and whatever the current trend or the research of the hottest, of the hottest book that's out there today? And so I want to take you back to biblical living, and that is what I'm all about. And so as we dig into the Bible, it's good to look and say, well, what does God say about this? And today I'm going to start with the issue of dairy. And that has many different facets to the conversation. When I was younger, again, it was whole milk versus skim milk, butter versus margarine. And today we have raw milk versus pasteurized milk. Should we drink almond milk instead? What about silk? What about all of these dairy substitutes and how they impact your health? And I just want you to remember that in ancient history, which so many people look to as this is the epitome, this is where it began, this is where we should center our health on what things were like before things were processed, I'm going to go all the way back to the children of Israel heading into the Canaan land. That was a land flowing with milk and honey. Two hot topics, dairy and sugar. But that wasn't anything about which they were concerned. If you look in Proverbs, you can see where it says, "And thou shalt have goat's milk, enough for the food of your entire household." God never said, make sure you're not consuming dairy because it's going to be poor for your health. But there is the argument that says, well, we have processed milk, we've pasteurized it, we've stripped it of its nutrients, and there is that element of it, which is an area of, which one is worse? The infections and the death that came from raw milk and the uncleanly environment in which it was produced and sold, or pasteurization, which strips it from the nutrients that God put in it so that they could bind and absorb properly within your body. And vitamin K2 and magnesium and potassium, if you are taking a supplement with those in it, it will help you absorb the nutrients to where they need to be and that calcium to where it needs to be. But I want you to know that there's no biblical reason or health reason why we as a people should be neglecting dairy from our diet. The next area of food groups that gets a lot of controversy is that of fat content. Should we as a people consume fat? And if we should, how much should we have? There's the idea that fat makes you fat, and then there's the idea that fat makes you full, and therefore you won't be consuming so much and so many calories. And one of the things that stuck out to me was how when Jesus was at the Last Supper, he took his bread and he dipped it in the sop, which sop is usually the juice that has flowed from the meat, and that has the mixture of fat and au jus that if you let it cool, it would rise and it would harden, and you would see that mixture of high fat content. And we didn't see Jesus skipping that and saying, no, that's going to be harmful for my body. We saw him eating it as if it was no big deal at all. Which leads me to the topic of higher fat meat. We see the Old Testament Jews who are bound to beef and lamb and fish and certain birds, but then there were all of these limitations on what they could eat and what they couldn't, and what was clean and what was unclean. And then as God was transitioning things in Acts from the Old Testament law to the dispensation and the mystery of grace and the time where the gospel is given to the Jews and to the Gentiles, we have that pivotal moment where Peter was having this dream and God said, here, eat this food, and it was filled with all of this unclean meat, and you see the pork, and Peter balked and said, no, God, I'm not going to eat that. Well, God said, don't worry about it. Those rules about meat, they're not there. You know what matters most is that you are asking the Lord's blessing upon this food. God didn't say, except for be really careful for the fat content in your ham and the fat content in your bacon. And it wasn't an issue. God's issue is, where is your heart when you're eating the food, and the issue of gluttony, but we'll talk about that at a different point in the next video. To eat carbs or not to eat carbs, that is the question. What I think is interesting is that the fat was considered a sign of blessing. And when you look at the prodigal son and the story of the prodigal son, when the prodigal son came home, the father said, go fetch the fatted calf and bring him in, and we are going to have a feast. And if you understand the elements of raising animals for food, the way that you would fat a calf, or the way that you fat a pig, or the way you fat anything, is by giving them grains. And so we as a society who don't want to be fat, we stay away from the grains because we know that it will fatten us up. But we as a society become so anti-carbs, anti-potatoes, anti-sweet potatoes, anti-legumes, anti-carrots, below ground vegetables. We're just, if it has a carb or if it has a starch, we avoid it. And yet we see Christ taking 5 loaves and 2 fishes and breaking them up and handing them to thousands of people. Now, I know when Christ says, I am the bread of life, that is completely a spiritual element, but it is based on the fact that bread was a daily sustenance for everybody. And he showed that as he was giving bread and fish to all of those people. If carbs were not to be eaten, why would he hand them out? And so then this goes to the element, well, yes, carbs are to be eaten, but in ancient times, carbs were soaked and grains were soaked to break down those harmful chemicals that our body can't easily digest, and that blocks the absorption of other nutrients. If you want to look at the healthiest way to prepare foods, you could look at the Old Testament law and how God tried to teach them the cleanliness aspects of food and what would cause them to be the healthiest. And nowhere in the ceremonial laws did he say, now make sure that before you eat or cook bread, that you soaked the grains first. Right now, the hot topic about foods and what foods we should eliminate from our diet, the hot topic is that of legumes and beans and phytates and lectins, and how that absorbs into our bodies and causes us to have leaky gut or inflammation or not absorb the nutrients that we need. And yet when you look in Ezekiel 4:9, you see that God had Ezekiel fill a pot with all of these legumes and grains and to use them for bread that would sustain him for an entire year. There were so many elements of good health in that bread that it created an entire brand of bread. When people say that we as humans were never intended to eat beans because to eat them you have to cook the phytates out of them, and people didn't know how to use fire and therefore they couldn't have cooked the phytates out of them, I look and I say, where did they get that from? It certainly wasn't from the Bible. And that brings me to the evolutionary elements of these fad diets versus the biblical elements of it. And I want to talk about the Paleo Diet, which is the biggest form of evolutionary food fiction possible. I'll admit it, when I first heard about the Paleo Diet, I thought, wow, that's really cool. That's based on clean food, food as closest to how God makes it as possible. And then as I started reading what they told you you could and you couldn't eat, and I thought, oh, hunters and gatherers. Yeah, we were hunters and gatherers. And then I thought, wait, hold on. No, paleo, hunters and gatherers, those are cavemen. And yet, when you erase evolution and the evolutionary mindset from it, you have to look back to Adam and Eve and you think, actually, no, they were gardeners and they had fruits and vegetables, and then after the fall they had lamb, and they were never really hunters and gatherers. They had always eaten food from a broad spectrum of options and food groups. And what I thought was funny was I had visited a section of our state where they were talking about the history of the period of hunters and gatherers, which there are in all different cultures when people first move into an area and you have that more tribal mindset. And they said, you know, and they would take those nuts and they would take those berries and they would grind them down. And then she said, and most of them died by the age of 30 because the grinding of the hard raw foods kept a little bit of the stone in that mixture, and when they would eat it, it would rub their teeth raw, and then they didn't have any teeth, and so then they couldn't chew their hard food anymore, and so they died. And I just kind of laughed and I thought, well, well, that would put a different spin on eating the paleo diet, because if the goal is for us to be healthier and live longer and to not have cancer and all of these things that ail us, well, yeah, if you die at 30, you're definitely not going to have those problems. And still go back to the Bible and say we were never originally a people of hunters and gatherers. We were gardeners and we were shepherds. And that is originally how God set it out to be. There are some people who will stop and say, well, if you're going to be biblical, the way that God really, really intended it to be was for us to be vegetarians, because we were in the Garden of Eden and we didn't eat any meat or any animals, and in the millennium, when Christ rules and reigns on the earth, man will walk with lion and the lamb and we'll be vegetarians again, and that's the way that it should be. And then there's a morph of that, which is the evolutionary spin of your all nature And we shouldn't eat meat because that is murdering another life form. And then when you take that to the Eastern religion mentality, it would be okay to kill this salmon or this deer so long as you gave the salmon or the deer thanks for giving of their life form and their essence to nourish you, which leads to cannibalism and that's where that led to, that shaman Eastern mindset, where we are all one and it is okay to eat anything because we are all matter, we are all equal. There's no difference between animal and mankind and matter. And so there are lots of viewpoints when it comes to being a vegetarian or a vegan. There's also the viewpoint that animals have become so processed that they will produce cancer in you. And really that's true about all foods. We have gone so far from the Garden of Eden, and yet this is our sustenance. And what I think is interesting about God is how all throughout the Old Testament, whenever there was a sacrifice, and it's essentially a barbecue with the herbs and the spices, and he says, and it's a sweet savor unto me. And I just kind of giggle thinking, even God likes a good barbecue. And so don't feel that to be spiritual or to be healthy, you have to eliminate any meat from your diet. The last food group that I want to talk about is sugar. And sugar right now is really the epicenter of conversation. Everything bad in your health comes from sugar. You name it, and right now it's being talked about. Sugar causes problems. And when I talk to my kids during devotional time, I try to point out things in the Bible that are contrary to popular opinion because I want them to think on their own. And I want their thinking to be directed from the Bible because that's the only truth that we can trust. And so when we go through our Proverbs, and the Bible says, eat honey because it is good, and it is good for the taste. And I look and I say, hey kids, are we supposed to eliminate sugar from our diet? And they say no, and I say why? And they say because the Bible says to eat honey, and honey is a sugar. And then you see Christ going to the fig tree. And sugar was not in and of itself a bad guy, but sugar is the one food group where the Bible does give a warning, and it says, eat so much honey as is sufficient for thee, lest thou be filled therewith and vomited. And we as a culture do overconsume sugar, and it is to the detriment of our health and our body. And I just want to point that out, that we should not eliminate sugars from our diet, albeit the closer you get to nature, the better things are, because honey actually has nutrients that are good for your body. And the non-processed sugars do retain those elements of the minerals and the vitamins that combine together that help you. But God says, eat so much honey as is sufficient for thee. And so there's that element of moderation in your diet. And that is what I want to talk about in the next video. You'll see it right there. Don't miss it. It will teach you how to lose weight in the healthy way as a teenager or at any age. See you then.